So some of those who are listening likely don't know that the very survival of about 4 billion people, so half the world's population, depends in no small part on the provision of ammonia as fertilizer. And ammonia is primarily derived from natural gas. And so what that means is not just on the energy front, let's point this out, is that the very food that is provisioning half the world's population is a direct consequence of the cheap and easy accessibility of natural gas. And so what's the idea here? That we're supposed to reduce our provision of fossil fuels? And what are we going to do on the ammonia front? We're going to drive the price of fertilizer ever more skyward? Well, if we do that, because that would be the consequence of reducing the plentiful supply of natural gas, if we do that, then what will happen is, clearly, food will get more expensive, and so will energy, but food will definitely get more expensive. And so what that will mean is that huge swath of the world's population that's living on the edge, where they can just right now afford enough food to feed themselves so they don't suffer the consequences of nutritional privation or even die, a huge proportion of those people are going to be tipped back into absolute poverty. Their children are going to be intellectually stunted as a consequence, and they might well starve. And then you think, well, why would we do that? And if the answer is, well, you know, some of us really believe that the planet should only have 1 billion people on it. If we have to have any people at all, then, well, maybe this is all part of the unconscious drive towards, and conscious drive to some degree, towards reducing the planet's population no matter what the price may be. And then you see how people justify this. They say things like, well, you know, if we don't take emergency action right now, which means let's make the poor even poorer, then the poor are really going to suffer 100 years from now. And I think, well, look, I don't have a lot of confidence in your ability to predict even a decade out, much less 100 years, with your unstable economic models that are predicated on an equally unstable climate model. So we can forget about your capacity to prognosticate 100 years down the road. But what you're saying essentially is that the hypothetical poor that occupy my utopian imagination are much more important than the actual poor right now, who will definitely die if we implement our higher energy, price-inducing, hypothetical environmental policies. You know, and one of the things that strikes me as so utterly absurd, it's partly why I found your book so interesting, is that somehow the people who are making such arguments have gained the moral upper hand. Even though you don't have to scrape beneath the surface very far to see not only the genocidal metaphor and the genocidal intent, but the actual genocidal impact of these policies. Because we're definitely tipping people back into absolute privation.
Yeah, there's a lot of really interesting stuff going on. I mean, I think one thing, why do they have the moral high ground? And this is something is really a core mission of mine to correct, is that, as I mentioned before, they really owned the issue of a good environment starting in the 60s, including loving nature, including caring about clean air and clean water, and more recently, caring about safety from climate. And that the pro-capitalism side really didn't concern themselves too much with this, rhetorically at least. And so the anti-capitalist side was able to own this issue. And when you own something as important as our environment and our planet, you do get the moral high ground. And then they supplemented this with this false alternative of you are either a climate change believer who hates fossil fuels, or you are a climate change denier who thinks fossil fuels are okay. So they created this total false alternative, which made no sense, because what makes sense with climate impact is to weigh it along with the benefits of fossil fuels. You cannot judge a prescription drug by only looking at negative side effects, and you can't judge fossil fuels by only looking at negative side effects or exaggerating negative side effects. You have to look carefully at our climate impacts, negative and positive, and then weigh them against the benefits that come with fossil fuels, including all the benefits that protect us from climate. So there's this false alternative. So what they did is they owned the morality of caring about our environment, and they owned the claim to science, because the climate change denial thing, so-called, didn't make much sense, because it's pretty obvious we impact climate at least some. But so doing those two things, they owned this issue. So people think, well, if I want to be a good person, if I want a good planet, and I want to be pro-science, then I have to hate fossil fuels. And a lot of what I've tried to do, and I think Michael Schellenberger and Bjorn Lomborg and Steve Koonin, I think what we've tried to do is look at climate in a humanistic, full context way. And we're breaking this false alternative, which is a lot of the reason we get a lot of hostility.